Hi, Nutrition 101. Welcome to Chapter 6, Part 2. This is Protein Functions and Food Sources. So we left off last time talking about denaturation and the necessity of protein needing to be denatured prior to being digested. So when we look at protein digestion and absorption really, the purpose of it is to denature that protein through hydrochloric acid and then start to break it apart using pepsin in the stomach. Pepsin is going to be an enzyme in the stomach. Continue to break apart those amino acids in the small intestines by secretions from the pancreas called pancreatic proteases and peptidases, and then also lastly in the intestines through intestinal peptidases and proteases. Now the purpose of all of those enzymes is to hydrolyze the bonds or to break apart those bonds by adding water. Just like with carbohydrates, the purpose of digesting carbs is to break apart the long chains of glucose, which are done by hydrolysis reactions too. So we add water, break them apart, we absorb them into the mucosal cell, and then pass them on to the liver through the portal vein, just like with carbs, a very similar process there. And then we end up with the amino acid pool. So the amino acid pool is the number of amino acids that are available for use in the body. So those could come from the diet, from the process I just mentioned. They could also come from breakdown of body proteins, and they're going to be used to make other proteins or chemicals or provide energy or make glucose or be stored as fat if you eat too much of them. So you can see this is just a visual depiction of the amino acid pool. So we have the digested proteins, we have the body proteins that are broken down, and then we can use those little, I like to call them Legos, so those little Legos to build up other body proteins or use them for something else. We can burn them up and use them as energy. We can make some glucose or fatty acids through gluconeogenesis. We can also make some non-protein molecules that contain nitrogen, because remember, proteins contain nitrogen, whereas our other macronutrients don't. So if we look at the instructions for proteins, the instructions for proteins are in our DNA. So our genes contain the instructions for protein. And different cells, are going to have certain genes turned on or turned off to determine what proteins they make. So something like a muscle cell is going to make actin and myosin, which are going to be our muscle proteins. Something like a red blood cell is going to make hemoglobin, which is the red blood cell protein. If we're missing an amino acid in our diet that happens to be a prevalent amino acid in a certain protein that a cell needs to make, it means that we won't be able to make that protein, and then we'll see some deficiencies occur. So whatever amino acid was limited, then there will be limited ability to construct that protein. Now that typically happens, in times of starvation, or if somebody's eating just a grain-based diet and not eating beans to go along with that, so there's not protein complementation going on. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So another issue with protein making could come from the DNA. So it could be a gene mutation. So if there's one sequence that's off in a genetic sequence, it can change the sequence of amino acids in a protein. And then remember, the sequence of amino acids are what determines the structure of the protein, and then the structure determines the function. So as you see in this little list here, the change in the sequence will change how a protein folds. Then the change in the structure is going to change the function. Good example of this would be in sickle cell anemia. There's one protein amino acid sequence that's miscoded, and so that takes the hemoglobin and turns it from a sphere into a sickle shaped, which then causes all sorts of problems in the body, and that would be a genetic mutation. So when we look at the functions of protein in the body, there are so many different functions. These are just some examples in terms of transport, movement, enzymes, and here's a long list of them here. So we can see that proteins are going to speed up chemical reactions. They're going to create some structure, so they create our musculature, send chemical signals, so things like insulin and glucagon are hormones that are proteins, transport of substances like in our red blood cells, movement of muscles, antibodies that are important for immunity, blood clotting, and fluid balance. And so you can see that the purpose of protein is so widespread in the body that really we would rather not use protein for energy. We would rather use protein to replenish and rebuild any of these different types of proteins in the body that are performing really important functions. This is just showing that fluid balance in terms of that edema and the foot swelling. We're seeing protein for movement, and for structure, we're seeing protein for immunity. So here, you've seen this this little visual a number of different times. We started with carbohydrates and then we moved on to fats. And now you can see that protein can be used in these different ways too. So you can see that glycolysis reaction is kind of going backwards. So protein can be turned into pyruvate, then used to make glucose. It's called gluconeogenesis. It can also be turned into acetyl-CoA and turned into fatty acids. It can also be turned into acetyl-CoA and turned into energy. Or you can use protein amino acids in the amino acid pool to synthesize other proteins. Notice that when the amino acids in the amino acid pool are used for energy or to synthesize fatty acids or to synthesize glucose, they need to be deaminated, which means that you need to take the nitrogen off because none of the substances in the citric acid cycle or gluconeogenesis or fatty acid synthesis use nitrogen. It's just protein. So we can actually measure protein status by measuring how much nitrogen we consume versus how much we excrete, because it should be pretty equal there. So there are two types of protein energy malnutrition. The first one tends to happen in children who are weaned off of breast milk a little bit early and given some sort of grain-based cereal, because that would be the staple crop in whatever society they live in. You can see that over on the left. What ends up happening with pure protein malnutrition, there's a limiting amino acid in the diet, most likely from eating cereal and not a legume to complement it, typically happens in babies, and typically you'll see a disruption in fluid balance, which causes that distended belly that you can see on that little girl over on the left. That's called kwashiorkor. Whereas over on the right, you see pure protein energy malnutrition, which is a lack of both food overall, energy, as well as a lack of protein, and that's called marasmus. And you can see with marasmus, it's pretty much pure starvation there. When we look at the undernourished populations in the world, you can see, places in Asia, some places in Africa, especially South America and Central America. You can see there are a number of places where we have, close to a fifth of the population as malnourished. When we look at protein on food labels, you can see that protein on the nutrition facts panel isn't emphasized so much because protein needs are really based on body weight. All right, so you can see here that protein, there's the value in grams, and then you sort of have to determine, okay, what are your needs? What would be the percentage of your needs based on body weight? And protein needs are, the RDA for protein is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, or the AMDR is 10 to 35% of total calories, which is a really big range. Now you can see with proteins in foods, we do have our typical, we think of the chicken, we think of beans, we think of meat, we think of eggs and dairy as being proteins that, provide some substantial intake there. But we also have other types of proteins that, act as stabilizers or flavor enhancers or thickeners or things like that in our processed foods. So there are other ways that we might see protein on the label. Proteins are also the cause for major allergens, so things like soy, fish, shellfish, peanuts, tree nuts, eggs, wheat, and dairy. A lot of times you'll see, like you see in bold down here, contains soy ingredients. A lot of times you'll see that same warning on a lot of labels that contain any of those allergens that I've just mentioned. And this is what I was talking about with nitrogen balance. So measuring nitrogen intake and nitrogen excretion can really show what your protein status is. Now, as healthy adults, which I'm assuming most of us are in this classroom, we want to be in nitrogen balance, which you can see over on the left. This yogi is showing balance, right? So nitrogen intake equals nitrogen output. Now, in times of sickness, we never really want to be in negative nitrogen balance. Even if we're losing weight, we want to try to hang on to that muscle, right? So nitrogen intake, when it's less than the nitrogen output, we consider ourselves in negative nitrogen balance. And then in times of life, like growth and development, or if somebody's pregnant, or if you're trying to gain weight, to build muscle or something like that, you would be in positive nitrogen balance, which means that your intake is greater than your output because you're adding structure onto the body. And as you can see here, the RDA for protein, right, is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight if somebody is over 19. And then you can see that the value goes up for body weight as we get younger and younger, right? And so you can think about this, like a 0 to 0.5-year-old is in such positive nitrogen balance at that point. They're almost doubling in size in a year or so. And so you can see at that age, right, from that 0 to 1, you need a lot more protein because you're naturally in a state of growth and development. So if we looked at a 2-year-old, right, we were looking at a 2-year-old here, if you can see over on this chart that, if a person is right around 1 to 3, they're going to need 1.1 grams per kilogram of body weight. So you can see that if this child is 14 kilograms, you would multiply 14 by 1.1 to get 15.4 grams of protein total a day. So, it's a little person. They're 14 kilograms, just about 30 pounds. And so they're not going to need a ton of protein per day. 15 grams of protein is not very much. It's a couple ounces of meat, for example, or 2 cups of milk, right? It's not very much protein, but, it's a lot for the body weight of that 2-year-old. So you can see here the protein recommended daily allowance, or RDA, is the minimum that people need. You can also use the AMDR, acceptable macronutrient distribution range, to estimate how much people are going to need in general, or what's acceptable to put into the diet. So you can see that the more a person weighs, the more protein is needed for maintenance and repair, and that minimum goes up. So if you had a 70-kilogram adult, you could take 70 kilograms and multiply it by 2.2 to get 154 pounds. Or, if you're 154 pounds, you can divide that by 2.2 to find your weight in kilograms. So that, the 70 kilograms times 0.8 grams per kilogram per day equals 56 grams. Now, that's a pretty low amount, right, of protein each day. Even for a vegetarian, you can meet those needs pretty easily. The average consumption is 70 grams of protein a day, so most of us are getting more than enough protein. When we look at populations that have higher needs, you're going to see athletes after injury, in lactation and during pregnancy and during infancy, as I had mentioned before, you're going to need a little bit more protein. It's estimated that pregnant and lactating women need to add 25 grams of protein a day to the diet in addition to their typical RDA, even as their body weight goes up. So we're going to talk a little bit about next time about different types of diets and how to meet protein needs within those different types of diets. This has been an overview of protein functions, as well as protein on the food label and protein needs.